welcome. The Democrats have a problem, and they've just made it a little bit worse. Heading into the midterm elections, they know the largely pro-Obama millennial generation is disappointed in government and not likely to turn out in big numbers. To try and win them back, the White House recently tweeted out its accomplishments aimed at helping the millennial generation. The tweet became controversial. Not the list, but the look of it. Note the cute emoji, the pictures of the, mortarboard and tassel, also the American flag emoji. Using these pictographs in place of words did not bring a smiley face to some millennials who saw this as blatant pandering to their socially networked generation. The White House removed the emojis. We'll get to the dwindling millennial vote in a moment. In our public intellectual segment today, some facts to calm the fears. We will meet a Swiss scientist who studies genetics to gauge the velocity of the Ebola epidemic. Then electronic medical records. Is the keyboard getting more hands-on attention than the patient? And what happened to that seamless national record system that electronic medical records was supposed to be? All this plus an uptown idea worth considering, a High Line for Harlem that could fund affordable housing. But first, understanding that third of the U.S. population born after 1980 and how to get them back to the polls or to the polls for the first time. Joining us, New School history professor Natalia Mehlman-Petrzela, who studies youth culture, and Jake Horowitz, co-founder and editor of Mic.com, a leading millennial news site. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Jake, I'm looking at your post on Mic.com called "Young People Don't Want to Vote in the 2014 Midterms. Here's who is to blame." Who's to blame?
Yeah, I think, speaking to the sort of emoji campaign, there's often a sort of a last-minute effort on the part of politicians to try to win young people's vote by doing things that play into the stereotypes of our generation, whether it's the emojis or the selfie generation or, you take your pick. Whereas we haven't seen sort of prolonged engagement and really reaching out to the millennial generation, in the process of governance. And so if you ask most young people today, they're totally fed up with their elected representatives, they're totally fed up with the state of politics, and it's not because they're not speaking our language with emojis, it's because, sort of on a day-to-day basis, on a weekly basis, we haven't seen the kind of change that we've been promised.
Let's put up the emoji slide again, just so people can get a better look at it, and we can talk for a minute about what this is about. I think this is a tempest in a teapot, and you're raising the real issues here. But just so we can pass over this, okay, past the American flag, opportunity tax credit, and then two down from that, capped, and it's kind of dark on your TVs, folks, but you could tell that that's graduation cap. So student loan payments at 10% of income for nearly 5 million students. But is it really so alienating to people to see these emojis if they're reading the content, which are policies intended to help the generation, increase Pell Grants by more than $40 billion, cap those student loan payments at 10% of income for nearly 5 million students? I mean, those are the things that people are demanding, right?
Yeah, Brian, I think it's about the voice and the authenticity and the sensibility of the whole thing. On the one hand, you're exactly right. Sort of White House talking about important, serious issues is an important thing. On the other hand, the presentation of it and sort of the playing into this sort of idea that millennials can only be reached by using characters and silly things sort of plays into the stereotype that we're being talked at and not having a conversation with.
So what should they do, Natalia? Speak to young people in the style of 50-year-olds?
Well, I think that's probably not the best strategy, and you can understand any political party, especially in this precarious moment, wanting to reach out any way they can. But what I think is kind of strange about the emoji, frustration with it is that I totally agree with you. It is infantilizing, I think. But I think the frustration must also derive from the fact that this report that came out put a very rosy face on the economic policies that the Obama administration is putting forth. There's no mention of really the severe economic distress that I think a lot of millennials are graduating into, are deeply in debt facing. And I think some of the frustration derives not only from the smiley faces, but from a sense that that's being glossed over.
Right. So there's a disillusionment with government taking place among this group. But this is a liberal group, by and large, right? I mean, when you look at politics by age, the millennials are the most liberal in the population today, aren't they?
Yeah, they absolutely are. But I do think that we perhaps can make a mistake by overgeneralizing too greatly of who and what millennials are. They encompass a wide range of issues that are different by gender, that are different by region, that even in this moment are very different by age. An 18-year-old's concerns are quite different from one of a 32-year-old starting their family. So I think to assume they're all liberal also is a little bit, shows a little bit of historical amnesia. All youth are not liberal, and all youth movements are not progressive.
Right, but I mean, in the Reagan years, for example, the younger voters were more pro-Republican than the older voters.
Right.
And now we have the opposite, right? A lot of these people who voted for Obama once, maybe twice, who are anywhere between, maybe 22 and 32, and if they're being turned off to government because the hope and, the Hope and Change Obama campaign has brought not that much hope and relatively little change. This is very different from the way the Tea Party is alienated from government.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you see an alienation from government among young progressive people that doesn't necessarily mean that they're less civically engaged. It means that they have less faith in government to enact these kind of changes. I think a good example of this is this whole rise in recent years of kind of conscious capitalism, right? All of these businesses which aim to have social purpose. The whole idea of social entrepreneurship or social innovation, a lot of young people I see channeling their energies to social change through those means. The problem with that to me is it doesn't question capitalism at all, right? There's no kind of interrogation of that system or faith in our kind of government institutions to change.
Is that your sense of what young voters want, a harsher questioning of capitalism?
I think it's, so I run a site called Mike, which reaches, 20-somethings, and we do periodic, sort of polls of our readers just to see what issues are really, really important to us. And if you ask most young people what issue they really care about, it's the economy. If you ask most people what foreign policy issue they really care about, it's climate change. And the issues are not a whole lot different than our parents. I think there's certain issues where young people as a generation, whether it's sort of social issues or sort of gender LGBT rights, it's sort of like a non-starter for us. Our mind has been made up. But on others, when it comes to the economy, and it's very, very complicated, and we have just as much sort of indecision as other generations.
Right. But I guess when we talk about the word capitalism, would that be a divisive buzzword among your readers? I mean, they don't want socialism, right? They don't want to go back to pre-1989 debates over capitalism versus state-run economies and stuff like that. I think they want a very successful capitalism in this country that's providing a lot of jobs, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, the number one issue, hands down, over and over and over again with our audience is income inequality. It's not let's overthrow capitalism, it's let's make the system a lot better.
Right. But then again, income inequality is an indictment of capitalism.
Absolutely. And with Occupy, I mean, we see a little bit of these tensions arise, right? On the one hand, there is a major grassroots movement, a counterpoint to the Tea Party with a deeply kind of anti-capitalist message. On the other hand, I think you're right that what I see in a lot of young people is actually wanting just a bigger piece of the pie, not to get rid of the pie itself. Even people who maybe align themselves with the Occupy cause, if not on a deep philosophical level.
What are you seeing among your readers about Obamacare? On the one hand, it's the biggest anti-poverty program in a generation. On the other hand, the big mandate was put on millennials to go out and buy health insurance when they're young and healthy that they don't want to have to buy, the individual mandate.
Yeah, so Obamacare is interesting. I wanted to actually use that example because, as I'm sure, both of you saw, that between Two Ferns campaign that sort of President Obama did with Zach Galifianakis was actually one of the ways that, the White House was able to speak to our generation in a way that actually spoke our language, that felt much more authentic, a lot different than the emoji campaign. And, young people actually signed up for healthcare. I think as a generation, we're still divided on it. There's questions about the long-term economic sort of effects that it's going to have on our generation. But, we believe in the idea that more people with more access to healthcare is more equitable and a good thing for society.
Are you studying Obamacare and its
Yeah,
impact on generational politics?
I think you make a really good point. I think, though, you again raise one of these kind of tensions within the what millennials face, which is, again, this kind of sense people should have health care, access to good care, access to these kind of policies. But then, there's a complete awareness that the economic world they're moving into, more freelancers, more adjuncts, less kind of job stability, less longevity in any particular career path has become a fact of life. How you reconcile those two, and this, you brought up gender issues before, feminism, work-life balance, these are other issues that also can be really devalued when you have a kind of more precarious economy relying on that kind of part-time labor. So,
as a historian,
yes.
Do you think there are specific ways to reach today's young generation, millennials, and get them engaged in voting and other political activity that's different from the past, young adults at their time as being young adults?
It's a good question. Well, I do think that look, the high point of kind of voter participation for 18 to 24-year-olds in our recent history was 1964. And then you see, yeah, I know, it's been a while, right? But then you saw a kind of drop off, and then you saw a jump up again actually in 2004, I think largely out of frustration with the 2000 election. These are presidential elections. I think actually, as we saw in 2008, the Obama administration was doing a really good job using all of these new media like Twitter, like Facebook. Now Obama's on Medium too. I think the emoji thing just felt so disingenuous because it was so superficial, right? And because the nature of an emoticon, and these are people who don't even study who don't even study politics, but study kind of linguistics. Also, I don't know if you remember in the early 90s, there were uproars about smiley faces in correspondence. And I think that that was the issue. I think using these new media and perhaps more concerted campaigns like you're talking about between two friends is a great approach. But of course, substantive policy, I think it's economic policy, I agree with you.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing, which is for millennials, it's all about authenticity. Like, hands down, it's about sort of not coming off as just somebody who's talking at you, whether that's a brand or a corporation, trying to sell us a product, or it's a politician trying to, sell us a policy. And I think, as sort of politicians think about reaching this demographic, it's obviously, Facebook, Twitter, Vine, Instagram, distribution has totally changed, and so there's new ways to reach us. But at the end of the day, using these just for the playfulness of it, as opposed to using them authentically to have a conversation, sort of will never get to us.
I think there's at least a generation-old cliche, which is the most successful politicians are the ones who are the best at feigning authenticity.
But I think, if you look at Cory Booker and what he's been able to do on Twitter, he's actually a good example of somebody who has some humility and comes off as somebody who has a dialogue and is not just a one-way conversation on Twitter, which is why people really take to the way he handles himself.
That's interesting. Who else is an example of doing it well?
I think, there's been times where sort of Rand Paul doing sort of things like the AMA on Reddit, or sort of, I actually think the Medium thing, in the case of President Obama was a good move. Rand Paul has really gotten it for this demographic, which is why, sort of young, fed-up libertarians is growing, that group, and he's been able to capture it.
Right. But to be a young, fed-up libertarian, you have to be a libertarian. And so if Obama and Rand Paul are kind of diametrically opposed in terms of what their economic policies would be and what the role of government in our lives would be and our economy would be, do you think people will gravitate toward whoever they see as the most authentic, or are they actually going to measure the content of the policy?
No, I think they're going to measure the content for sure. It's about authenticity at the end of the day, as you said. It's about results. And are things getting better? But that being said, the way that you talk to this demographic actually really matters, which is the same thing for the way that brands talk to this demographic, and that really matters.
Yeah, and I think there's no reason to think that using new media need be gimmicky or anything. Think of FDR and fireside chats on the radio, right? That was new media for a presidential candidate, or even television ads, or the debate between JFK and Nixon in 1960, which changed.
When television was new media.
Exactly, and so I think we can be a little bit, we can forget that there's a long history of using new media, and that it doesn't, I think even the idea of kind of pandering to young people devalues both the strategy and the people that you're talking to as both disingenuous.
So. But you have to use the media that people are actually consuming.
Of course,
So you're not just going to appeal to 18 to 32-year-olds by going in a print edition of a newspaper.
Of course. That's why I think there's nothing inherently wrong with you, or inherently superficial or cheesy about using Facebook and Twitter. It's a good idea. Why not?
I would also just raise issue with the timing. It's really important that this is not sort of like every time an election comes around, sort of 3 to 6 months before the election, we start using Facebook, because now we need to get the young people. the way to do it is to build, and that's what Cory Booker's done really well. Like, it doesn't matter if it's an election or just a regular day in Newark or New Jersey now.
Yeah.
He uses it throughout the course of his governance.
And certainly a lot is being written in journalism now as this election comes close and the Democrats are in danger of losing their Senate majority, that they're getting desperate and they're just trying to appeal to those core groups in their base to turn out African Americans, women, millennials. But I think you've written, or somewhere in Mike.com, there was a piece about how turnout is going to be low in the midterm elections, as it always is in midterm elections, but even lower among millennials than other groups.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, it's interesting. So we polled our audience on the same exact question very recently, and they all said they want to vote, sort of 66% plus want to come out and vote, but that they don't sort of necessarily have somebody to vote for because they're sort of so fed up with the system more generally. I can't sort of project necessarily whether it's going to be the lowest of any demographic, although sort of early signs from our readers and just from knowing people in their 20s are not a lot to sort of be hopeful for and come out for.
So what's the other side doing? Just saying everything that old white men want to hear?
The other side in what
The
sense?
Republicans?
The Republicans. Well, I think that they're using some of these media as well, and I think that like I said before, I don't think that we should assume young people do tend to vote liberally, right? They're Democratic, but I don't think that that's a foregone conclusion. There's plenty of research on millennials that say that they're kind of less brand loyal, and they're I think more registered as independents. Is that right? Or not registered with a particular party, which makes them a harder group to court also. But I think for that reason, everything is kind of up for grabs. And of course, it makes more sense that Republicans, as sort of, the GOP, the grand old party, are less intuitively linked to using some of these new strategies that are associated with kind of progressive media. But I don't think that's going to stay that way, right? I think that these are going to be the new norms of communication.
Maybe we're having the wrong conversation altogether by putting so much focus on the election. Maybe what millennials really want as a generation that's disillusioned with electoral politics is other ways to influence the system. But the media talks elections, elections, elections because they're like sports.
I think that that's probably right. I mean, I really think, and I'm not the first person to say this, but that millennials, and I see this as a college professor with a very engaged student body and talking to people who aren't even that much younger than me all the time, it's a very socially engaged group who want to make change, who want to do things, who are not disillusioned in the way that we saw it, let's say, in the early 70s, right? Where after Watergate, during Vietnam, you had this sense that all of that promise of the civil rights movement was lost, right? Government can't do that for you. We're turning inward. This is the new age. This is retreats, drop out of society. That is not what's happening with millennials, but I really think that they see different ways of getting involved. And like I said, I think a big part of that is this kind of sense of starting something, of a disruptive economy, and there are problems with that phrasing too. But I think that that is seen as a sort of more dynamic path.
Last word. What's the conversation on the day after Election Day?
I think the conversation on the day after, everybody's going to be thinking about how it affects 2016 and whether sort of, Hillary is going to be the candidate for millennials or not.
But that's the standard political analysis.
I think the conversation after Election Day is it's very much tied to this. It's, this is a generation that, hashtag activism and petitions on places like change.org sort of have a bad rep, for people who are older. But for this demographic, we actually use these to make change. I mean, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, which went viral on Facebook and saw more engagement than anything else, was actually like something real for this demographic. And by the way, happened to raise a lot of money for that cause.
Okay.
So I think the conversation has to be, okay, election's over, 2 years to actually have an authentic dialogue with this generation on issues like student debt and student loans, the economy, climate change, race, et cetera. How are we going to use these channels to do it?
Thank you both very much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change minds and public policy. Today, a study of Ebola. To date, there have been at least 4,500 confirmed deaths in West Africa and twice as many estimated to be infected. But the World Health Organization predicts 5,000 to 10,000 new cases each week by December. Is that alarmist or likely? It helps to understand genetics. An October study in the online journal PLOS ONE details the rate at which Ebola spreads. The lead author, Tanja Stadler, is a researcher in the Department of Biosystems and Engineering at ETH Zurich, a university in Zurich, Switzerland, and she joins us via Skype. Thank you for coming on with us. Hello from New York.
Hello. Hello from Switzerland.
What exactly were you trying to learn with your research?
So we looked at genetic data of Ebola in order to understand how fast Ebola is spreading in West Africa.
What do you mean by genetic data?
So essentially what we had available was public health officials in those countries took blood samples, sent them actually to the US, to Boston, and then researchers there in a lab looked at this data to extract the information about the particular Ebola virus in each patient. And you can envision that as each organism is characterized by a certain genetic code, and those researchers in those laboratories provided us this genetic code.
So is it the genetics of the virus, or is it the genetics of the individuals infected?
It's the genetics of the virus. And then the main idea, what we are working on, or we did work on in the past for other pathogens and now worked on for Ebola, was we used this genetic information and put it into our software package, which outputs at the end the speed of transmission, the rate at which Ebola spreads in those countries.
So it's a computer model, basically.
Yes, it's a computer model which gets informed by the virus genetic data. And the idea it does this is that imagine two individuals transmitted the virus yesterday to each other, then today they would still have a very similar genetic information of the virus. While if there was a transmission event weeks ago, the viruses in the different individuals evolved for a couple of weeks. So those viruses look very different in the two different patients. And based on the information, how similar viruses are, we reconstruct essentially the past transmission chain. And that allows us to calculate the past transmission rates and the speed of transmission.
So this was done before the current outbreak, correct?
So our study was done in September. We performed a study in September, so on data of the current outbreak. We had data from Sierra Leone only until mid-June though. So we had data available from mid-May to mid-June in Sierra Leone. Thus, we can estimate everything about the epidemic until mid-June. Now, we hope to get newer genetic sequencing data. There, the problem though is that the officials in those particular countries have to collect more data. However, as you can imagine, medical people, nurses, etc., they have other worries right now than sending blood samples, say, to the US where we got the sequencing done. They not only fight for the lives of their patients, but actually a lot of the health workers also died already of Ebola.
Indeed, of course. So would you say that the spread of the virus as we've been seeing it in recent weeks does more to confirm the models that you came up with or to challenge them about how fast it would spread?
So actually what now the WHO predicts for the future is roughly in line also what we see until mid-June. Obviously the epidemic slows down a little bit because it's just, you can imagine, the more people are infected, the less new people are available for infection from a perspective of the virus. So it slows down slightly and people try to prevent transmission, but the overall speed is still along the lines what we estimate.
Would there be different rates in different areas, geographically speaking, based on the genetics of the virus?
So we don't have any indication that based on the genetics of the virus, there is a differential in the rates of transmission. But obviously in different countries, or if people behave differently, we can have very different rates of transmission. Also, as we saw, only 3 countries, namely Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, really have severe outbreaks, while Nigeria could control the epidemic. And that is most likely not due because they had a less dangerous strain, but because they have different public health measurements.
Can you talk about those? What different public health strategies in Nigeria are containing it better than those other countries that you mentioned?
So here I would suspect, and this actually, though I can't totally confirm with you right now, but so the main problem the 3 countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, is that at funerals, people are still buried traditionally. That means people do hug the dead body, people kiss the dead body. And if somebody died of Ebola, you can imagine that all the liquids that person has around him or her contain the deadly virus. So people actually get severe, often infections at those funerals. And for example, Ebola in Sierra Leone started because some people went to a funeral in a bordering Guinea and actually got infected there, and then started this severe outbreak in Sierra Leone.
Relative to other diseases, how catching would you say Ebola is?
So first we have to note that this characteristic number, which also we calculate, the so-called reproductive number, meaning how many people are infected on average by a single person, for Ebola is roughly 2. Meaning if somebody is Ebola on average, he or she transmits to 2 additional people. That's slightly higher than, say, influenza. It's most likely slightly lower along the range of HIV. So it's roughly in that range. The severe thing with Ebola is that it's so deadly in such a short time.
Yes. But are the numbers that I read in the introduction consistent with your understanding that there have been fewer than 5,000 cases globally to date, but that the WHO expects there to be 5,000 per week by December?
Sure, because this reproductive number, if it's 2, that means within an infection, which takes roughly 3 weeks, each now infected individual will infect 2 more people. Meaning if we have now 5,000 people infected, they'll each infect over the course of the next 3 weeks 2 more people, which makes 10,000 people.
And just to correct myself, it's about 5,000 deaths so far. I think about another 5,000 believed to be infected so far, but still 5,000 per week would be an incredible rate of growth. Last
Right.
question, do you see the virus mutating in response to any treatments? I realize there are very few effective treatments so far, but is the virus already mutating to survive humans' attempt to combat it?
So that, unfortunately, we can't address right now because we don't have the latest genetic sequencing data. As I said, it's so hard to collect the data because people expose themselves to a possible Ebola infection. So we have to wait. We're in contact with the WHO to get access to latest data if new data is being collected. But as of now, we don't have genetic information newer than the June data.
Thank you very much for sharing your research with us.
Thank you.
And that's Public Intellectual for today. I'm Brian Lehrer. Texas Health Presbyterian was the hospital where the first U.S. Ebola patient, Eric Duncan, wasn't properly diagnosed on his first visit. Initially, the hospital blamed electronic health records for allowing him to slip through the cracks, despite a fever that spiked to 103 and telling a nurse he had recently arrived from Africa. Duncan was given Tylenol and released. The hospital has since backpedaled on its blame the computer defense, but the excuse raises questions. What is the effect of computerized record keeping on medical practice? Many doctors complain the keyboard gets more hands-on attention than the patient. And what happened to the decades-long project to standardize electronic health records? With some answers, Dr. Joel Zinberg, Associate Clinical Professor of Surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital, and via Skype from Washington, Brookings Healthcare Information Technology expert, Niam Yaraghi. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Dr. Zinberg, first on the Dallas Hospital connection. do you completely wipe clean the hands of electronic medical records before we get into what the real problems with them are?
Yes, I mean, it's sort of a silly explanation. I mean, there's no excuse for the physicians involved not to have asked an African man coming into their emergency room with a fever and abdominal pain about his travel history. Particularly when Ebola has been in the news for several weeks now, you'd have to be living in a cave, never mind living in a medical center, to not know about that.
And my understanding is they did actually ask, and one of the medical professionals wrote down, had recently traveled to Africa with an exclamation point, but somehow it didn't break through people's awareness.
Well, what happened apparently was that a nurse asked, but the physicians involved didn't ask. And as I said, it's no excuse that the medical record in some way obscured that information. However, the very fact that the hospital thought to offer that explanation, I think, is quite indicative of the fact that hospitals and physicians feel they're being forced to buy expensive electronic systems that are actually difficult to use and maybe hindering care rather than enhancing it.
So, Niam, before we absolve the electronic medical records entirely in the Duncan case, is it possible that a system needs to be put into place for the right people to read them in the right way, and that even if this nurse entered something in a way that was designed to catch attention, it's still a potential flaw of electronic medical records rather than in-person communication that allowed this flag to be missed?
I think there is not a problem with the electronic medical records or more generally electronic health records, but the problem is with how these systems are being used. So there is a structure in which they enter the data and then how they read the data, but the problem is that these systems are not properly matched with the workflow of the medical providers in the emergency departments. So the system on theory is working properly, but the point is that using this system is very hard.
So, Dr. Zinberg, you don't want to go back to paper medical records, do you?
Part of me does, and there were some settings in which I still use paper medical records. But really, just to amplify that answer, you know, the records are voluminous on electronic records. They're incredibly comprehensive. Hospitals and all sorts of providers are encouraged to collect every last bit of information. There are templates that require that all the boxes be filled in. And in some ways, that really does get in the way of communicating information. Typically, when you're following a patient, you look at the most recent notes to see what's changed, what's new, what's relevant. And instead, you're often confronted with this enormous record filled with all sorts of stuff that's relatively extraneous, but people feel compelled to put it in for a variety of reasons. One, they've been told more comprehensive is better. Two, more comprehensive notes are more remunerative. Three, hospitals are now being judged by the government and for their reimbursements and for other measures on how comprehensive the notes are. And unfortunately, a lot of information gets lost in the process. It's difficult to see what's new and important.
So, Niam, this is a real paradox and an irony, it seems to me. A system designed to gather more information about each patient's health winds up obscuring what's important. Is there a policy fix to that? Should doctors themselves be writing this software instead of software experts? I don't know who's writing it. But what would be the fix to that? Because in theory, comprehensive information is a better thing than less comprehensive information, but the way Dr. Zinberg described it, not necessarily in real life.
I think we are at the beginning of the road in terms of the electronic health records. We were very excited with the HITECH Act and decided to go as far as we can and collect as much data as we can. But we, I think, during the process, forgot about how to use this data. So all the systems that are available here are really great in collecting as much information as possible, but they do not provide any feasible solution on how to use this information and how to extract those bits and parts of the information that may proven to be critical in providing care to the patient. As in the example of the Ebola case that we are talking about, there are numerous pieces of data and information entered into these systems, but there is no way for a physician to get the exact part of the information that he needs from those systems. I don't think there is any policy that can be implemented in order to help with this problem. The only thing that we can hope for is that during time, with the collaborations of physicians and IT professionals, better and more user-friendly systems come to the picture and help us with this problem.
Dr. Zinberg, does politics come into play here somewhere? You write for the City Journal, which has a reputation as politically conservative, associated with the Manhattan Institute think tank. But I thought that originally there was a left-right consensus about electronic medical records. When people were debating Obamacare, for example, and I realize it even predates that, but when people were debating Obamacare and electronic medical records was one of the things in it, everybody was saying, well, we like that, so we could break that out, and everybody would pass that and leave those other divisive parts aside. So was there a political consensus on electronic medical records, left, right, and has that broken down now?
I think there always was something of a consensus. I mean, there was always some concern on different ends of the political spectrum about the privacy issues that these records pose. But as their potential usefulness, I don't think there was much discord between the right and the left. And in fact, as you say, these medical records are really encouraged by the 2009 stimulus package, which include the high-tech provisions that your other guest referred to. I don't think there's discord about it now, other than in the sense that there are a lot of mandates that come along with these electronic records. And there's a sense in medicine that the record's purpose is not so much to improve care as it is to provide a vehicle for the government to collect information. And I'm not saying this in any Orwellian sense, but a way to collect information that's useful to them, to do research, to demographic
figure out
information.
the best practices and
Exactly.
what's cost effective if we're trying to control medical costs.
That and a variety of things, but that there's been a problem when HHS does their certifications of these packages. They haven't paid enough attention to the usability, and they haven't paid enough attention to the interoperability, which is the ability of one package to talk to another. I mean, part of the promise of these records is that they're going to make it possible for a physician in one institution to seamlessly retrieve records from care that the patient got elsewhere, and we're miles away from that now. Part of the problem being that the government hasn't paid very much attention to setting standards here. They've been more concerned with other things. So I don't think that's a right-left issue particularly.
But there, I hear you kind of alluding to a government mandate problem here, which in general conservatives would object to maybe a little more strenuously. So it's that the medical records, the electronic medical record system is probably inevitable and would evolve because that's how we keep records these days.
Right.
But the government trying to force its speed for its own purposes is kind of perverting its usefulness?
Look, the fact of the matter is you didn't need a government mandate or government prodding to get businesses to adopt accounting software, to adopt spreadsheet software. When it became good software that was cost effective, they adopted it, and the better programs rose to the top, and the poorly functioning programs were discarded. That's not what's happening here.
Niam, I wonder if you would have a different view of that at Brookings. I mean, I could imagine a counter-argument that would go, well, if you just left it to the market, then the electronic medical record software would spring up for the benefit of doctors, for the benefit of insurance companies, not necessarily for the greater public good in terms of public health data keeping and things like that.
That, and I also would like to include that the difference between an accounting software and an electronic medical record is that when you're talking about the accounting software, you're talking about a business who is paying for its costs itself and has a source of revenue. It's working in a completely free market. But in the case of healthcare market, unfortunately, it's not a completely free market here. So we have Medicare and Medicaid as the largest payer of the medical system here in the United States, and following the free market logic, then we cannot argue as that much with the Medicare and Medicaid as the largest customer here for mandating a requirement, let that be electronic medical records. This is the first thing. And the other thing that I want to mention here is that despite all the criticisms about the HITECH Act and its effects, we cannot ignore that in 2008, 83% of the doctors and 90% of the hospitals were managing their patient records on paper. Only 5 years after, in 2013, 81% of the doctors and 97% of the hospitals have some sort of electronic health record that qualify for the federal incentive. It is a huge step forward. I totally agree with you that we have a lot of problems, but we are at the beginning of the road, and I think the federal incentives helped us really to improve the current status of using information technology within the healthcare market.
So the two of you disagree on the value of the federal mandates, but do you think, Niam, that doctors can talk to each other through these records or get information in the way that this was originally sold to us as facilitating? That is, if somebody is sick in Dallas, somebody in New York who might also want to treat that person will be able to see it, and they're learning about individual patients through electronic medical records between offices that way?
No, we're still not there, but we should not also forget that the HITECH Act and the provisions of the HITECH Act, the first and second meaningful use criteria, were not designed to promote the complete exchange of information between different electronic medical record systems. Yes. Those two stages of the federal incentives were provided only for adopting EHRs and minimal use of the EHRs. The newly designed and upcoming third stage meaningful use criteria would be the ones that focus on meaningful exchange of information between these systems. So the answer to your question is that no, we are not able to smoothly exchange medical information between different electronic medical records. But the reason for that, at least from the federal incentive perspective, is that those incentives were not designed to promote electronic exchange of medical information between providers. They were only designed to incentivize the mere adoption and minimal use.
Thank you. So, Doctor, before you go, it's funny, I talk to parents all the time about new media, and they say, oh, my kids don't look at me anymore, they're only looking at their screens. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who had a medical condition and who said, my doctor doesn't look at me anymore, he only looks at his screen. Is the electronic medical records imperative getting in between doctors and their patients? And if we assume that free market or otherwise electronic medical records are going to become ubiquitous, is there a way around that?
Well, your impression is absolutely right. If you go into any medical practice nowadays, you'll see physicians and nurses scurrying around computer in hand. And the complaints from patients are ubiquitous, that my doctor doesn't look at me anymore, they never make eye contact, and because the doctor is so busy entering data and the nurses are so busy entering data, and that's a quality problem. I mean, getting back to the Texas hospital, you can't help but wonder if the nurse was not so busy entering data, he or she would have done what nurses have traditionally done over the years. They would have spoken to a colleague and said, boy, this is a problem. We have someone here who may have Ebola, but in fact, maybe they were so busy entering data they didn't have the opportunity. And if a physician wasn't so busy entering data, maybe they would have had time to ask the questions. I mean, this complaint that I'm spending all my time entering data is in every sphere of medicine now. I think perhaps it's something we'll overcome when the systems get better, but part of the problem is, as I alluded to before, you're busy filling out templated forms which are meant to comply with these mandates. And by the way, mandates that Niam referred to, the meaningful use stage 1 and 2. Stage 2 is still way behind schedule in the sense that most providers have not complied. They haven't met the standards. So stage 3 is somewhere off in the distance. So it's only in the sense that I think you were alluding to the ideological issues before. There's no question, I think, that medical records have use. Somewhere down the line, they'll be very useful in terms of cutting costs and improving quality of care. We're not there yet, and I think we may be stunting the growth somewhat by not allowing the market or innovative software people to get into it and see what works rather than complying with mandates.
Do you ever feel as a physician, I could write better software than I'm being given?
Well, I mean, look, the fact is there are, it's presumably a collaboration, but there are some things which just seem as if they never consulted a physician. So in my hospital, oncologists have a lot of difficulty writing chemotherapy orders. Now you would think this is an obvious thing, but the way the software was set up, it's apparently very difficult to do. I sometimes want to write an order, but when you go on to the order set, it's not there, and then it becomes very difficult to figure out how to do it.
And there's also just a human learning curve here, I think. As the screens become more integrated into our lives, we learn, whether it's in medicine or anything else, how to continue to communicate with our fellow human beings, in this case looking them in the eye when they're there on an office visit, while still needing to do what you didn't used to have to do on a screen.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And some people do that better than others. Some software writers do it better than others. There are people who think Apple is far more intuitive than the Windows products. And maybe we'll find an Apple equivalent in the electronic health record system sometime in the near future.
And maybe the next generation will do it more intuitively as digital natives, I hope.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
And Niam, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, a high line for Harlem that could trigger affordable housing. Rails to trails and affordable housing are both good ideas, but rarely do they come together in one project. Manhattan's downtown High Line is a huge success, but as it weaves through luxury condos, it encourages more to be built. However, a new proposal for a Harlem promenade could result in both a linear park like the High Line and affordable homes. The man with the plan is Daniel Marks Cohen, the Vice President and Director of Real Estate Development at the affordable housing organization called the Housing Partnership. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we have some slides to show our viewers of the renderings of this. So let's put the first one up right away, and then we'll talk through some of the visuals. So here we go with the first view. Tell us what we're looking at.
So this is an example that was drafted by Office of James Burnett, which is a landscape architect, of what a potential park on top of the rail lines would look like. It's a little different from the High Line itself, because the High Line, the park, was built on the rail bed. This is actually being built above the Amtrak rail lines. And although this design is beautiful and fanciful, it's in likelihood going to be much smaller and maybe not more than a few blocks rather than like a mile.
Give us our bearings here. We're seeing the Hudson River over there and the George Washington Bridge.
Right. So this is about 140th, 145th Street. The Riverbank State Park.
Just above the Riverbank State Park.
Yeah, it's just above Riverbank State Park.
Which is 135th Street.
Right.
And there's the bike path, which goes the length of the Hudson River in Manhattan at this point, which is running somewhere along there. And there's the Henry Hudson Parkway or West Side Highway somewhere along there, right?
Right. In this case, it's actually been put at grade, but it's actually an elevated highway. This is just an example of what it might look like. The park is really supposed to be the focus. And although this is one example of what it could be, it isn't likely to be quite this long.
Right. The tracks, these are the Amtrak tracks coming out of Penn Station as the Amtrak heads north along the river toward Albany and other points north and west.
Right.
So where do they emerge from underground?
Sure. Right at 123rd Street to about 158th Street is where the rail lines are uncovered by Riverside Park. North of 158th Street, they actually switch positions with the highway and they hug the shore of the Hudson River all the way up to Albany to Canada, actually. But this one section, and the reason why that's the most important, is because that one section is actually zoned land and has air rights, which can be used for In this case, we're proposing for affordable housing.
Aha. So this next slide gives us a sense of how you define those air rights and why they give you an opportunity for affordable housing. And again, I guess the top is west. So that's Riverbank State Park.
That's
at the
right.
Top, and the river, and then then you're moving into Manhattan there, Broadway to Amsterdam, et cetera.
That's right. The southern end, between 123rd and about 130th Street, and the northern third, about 145th Street to about 158th, are zoned land that can be used. It's actually residentially zoned land, but we're not proposing to build anything on top of at least certainly no housing on top of the rail line. What we're proposing is actually the air rights would be transferred over into this yellow-lined area, which would be a new special purpose district on Broadway.
Along Broadway.
Yes.
What's there right now? This is just north of where Columbia is going to put its West Harlem campus?
Precisely. Manhattanville is actually a little bit, about 125th to about 135th Street. And there are about a dozen sites along Broadway that are taxpayer sites. There are 1 to 2 story retail sites. There are no people living in them. It's just retail businesses. And what we're proposing is the air rights would be transferred over to be developed on those sites. Currently, the zoning rules allow for a 12-story building. We're suggesting a little slightly taller building to allow for greater density in exchange for 50% affordable housing.
So here's another view that helps to explain that same thing.
Right. So this is a cross-section which shows the Amtrak rail lines, and then the air rights would be sort of transferred over to Broadway and to potential receiver sites, as I mentioned. They would actually enable the sites to be built slightly taller than they currently are allowed.
Do you have any community opposition? Do people know about it yet? Because in general, people object when more high-rise development is coming to their neighborhood anywhere in the city.
For sure. We've had a chance to talk with all of the elected officials, and we've had a chance to meet with the community board and a number of community stakeholders, and the response has generally been quite positive. I think people have lots of questions, and we're hoping to work through the process to satisfy them. Part of the reason why this proposal has gotten some attention is because we're talking about 2,000 units of affordable housing that will be permanently affordable. Under the current zoning, someone could build on those dozen sites that I mentioned tomorrow, and they could be 100% market rate luxury housing, or in some cases they could be what's known as an 80-20, 80% market, 20% affordable. We're proposing 50-50.
50-50. And this, I guess, is consistent with the de Blasio administration's view of both, or vision, both of a lot of affordable housing and of density.
Yes.
Increased density as a means to that affordable housing.
Mayor had a proposal of 200,000 units over 10 years that would be maintained and created affordable units, and this would certainly dovetail with that objective of 50% affordability. And
this next rendering, it seems to indicate that you're not even talking about buildings that are that much higher than what's presently there?
Right. What we're trying to show is that the current zoning will allow 12 stories, and then just by adding a few more stories to go to 16 stories, you'd be able to absorb all of the excess air rights, which we estimate to be about 2 million square feet over the rail lines. If you don't allow those extra 4 stories, you have less square footage to be absorbed, and it's less affordable housing.
Why stop at 16, for that matter? There are plenty of buildings right nearby there in Harlem that are more than 16 stories, right?
Sure. Well, Harlem went through put a lot of thought into a rezoning process in 2012, and they upzoned a certain area at 145th Street and Broadway, and they made that 16 stories, or 160 feet was the maximum height limit for that intersection. And we thought that since they already had accommodated that by providing inclusionary housing at that intersection, that we would also adhere to 160 feet as well.
Tell us some about your organization, the Housing Partnership.
Sure. We've been around for almost 40 years, and we've helped create about 40,000 units of affordable housing. We're not a developer, but we partner with real estate developers to help facilitate the creation of affordable housing in all 5 boroughs.
How optimistic are you about the future and the possibility of the de Blasio administration reaching its 200,000 goal?
I think it's ambitious, but there certainly seems to be a strong head of steam behind it, and we're hoping to be a part of it.
One more slide here. This, I guess, explains visually some of what you were saying before, but why don't you walk us through this?
Sure. So under the current zoning, about 2,000 units of housing could be constructed. About 1,600 units would be market rate, and 400 units would be affordable under what's known as the 80-20 model. In our proposal, we would actually create essentially 4,000 units of housing, and it would be split, 2,000 market rate units and 2,000 affordable units. So for a slight increase in the total amount of market rate units, you get a substantial increase in the number of affordable units. And an important thing to note, Brian, is that right now the area median income for New York City is about $86,000. But in West Harlem, it's about 40,000. So when we talk about affordable, we mean making sure that the units are affordable for people who live in West Harlem, in that 40,000 for a family of 4 range.
We just have a minute left as we look at the aerial rendering of the potential promenade again. The economics are that the park subsidizes the housing to some degree?
No, actually, what is the sale of the air rights. The air rights are about 2 million square feet, and they're owned by the city. And those would be sold to private developers who would build on those dozen sites that I've mentioned before. And the sale of those air rights, let's say they're sold at $100 a foot, which is below market to incur the creation of affordable housing, would yield about $200 million. And that money would go towards construction of the affordable housing, as well as some public infrastructure improvements like park improvements, and maybe some improvements to the transportation network.
So where are we at in getting this approved and built?
Well, we're in the process. As I've said, we've been talking to the community board and elected officials and city agencies. We're optimistic it's moving forward at the pace that we thought, and we hope to come back soon and talk about its further success.
Do you see similar models that create more Highline-like parks and affordable housing elsewhere in the city, or is this unique to this place?
If this proposal becomes reality, it will be the largest creation of affordable housing units in almost half a century since the creation of the Brook houses in the 1950s. There have been lots of proposals for affordable housing, and there's been lots of proposals for Highlines. Queensway, which is the Rails to Trails or Rails to Park proposal that's under consideration now, but they rarely include both, and it's because there's available air rights that we're able to enact this proposal.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And that's our show for today. We are here at this hour with a new program each week at this time. Next time, payday loans, the loan of last resort. But did New York make a mistake outlawing them? And do tune in to my daily radio program weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, the hidden roots of the financial crisis with Adam Davidson from NPR's Planet Money. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.